I don't know. I don't care. Just go with Baloue.
Cool.
Wow.
Sounds great.
That's a new leaf for Peter.
You okay, Peter?
We're really
just
hitting
like-
the end of the season here.
You know what? I get too hung up on all these things being correct when I should just go with the flow, guys. I'm turning over a new leaf.
Whoa.
Who's going to make sure we're not dumbasses, though?
Oh, yeah. Okay. I retract my new leaf.
Back on top. Welcome to I'd Buy That for $1, a podcast about inexpensive, common, and underappreciated records that are waiting to be rediscovered. I'm your host, Sean Hartman, producer of the cult classic compilation series. Not really sure if I would call this music.
Ooh. I am really sure I would buy that
Yeah, I thought so.
for more than $1.
I think your noise music bona fides make you a good choice to curate this selection.
You know what? I agree.
I'm co-host Jeremy, and I might be the most disgusting person on earth, guys.
You just might be. It's not
Yeah.
confirmed. You got some competition.
I was driving around earlier today, listening to this week's album, right? And I had my windows down because it's a beautiful sunny day out, and I pull it up to the stoplight, and this lady in the car next to me has her window down and looks over and gives me the most disgusted face. Like she had just caught me like peeing in a Gatorade bottle or something.
Yeah, you're definitely on some watch list now, my dude. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I was like, I just like suddenly felt very defensive. Like I'm doing it for a podcast.
It's for a podcast.
Did you clarify? Did you turn the music down and try?
No, I just tried to like face forward again and just pretend it didn't happen. It was
Ma'am, you don't understand. I'm kind of a historian, but it's for a podcast. It's kind of like radio.
Well, I think it was the music, Jeremy. It wasn't you. If that's
phew.
if that helps. And we'll get there soon. But first, I am co-host Peter Cook, and let me tell you, I want to lose control for about 15 minutes, and then I'll feel real cool for the rest of the night.
All right. You want to do it at the top of the episode or towards the end? Maybe in the middle?
I'm doing it right now.
Oh,
You think you really know me?
sort of. I mean, everybody has layers, you know?
Yeah, you contain multitudes, for example.
Yeah. We all do.
Well, Sean.
Yeah, who's joining us today? You want to intro the guests now, or
No, the guest is a mystery to Jeremy and I. The guest is our artist and album. And we are going into this for our audience. This is a unique circumstance. Sean requested of Jeremy and I to not do any research in advance. And I hear tell that you're also breaking some rules here, Sean, as you're prone to do.
bit of a rule breaker, bit of a wild card. You know me. We're talking about an album that I would argue fits the criteria of this show, but just barely, because original copies are going to cost you over $1,000.
Yeah, inexpensive.
But the reissue, still under 10, and there are some interesting reasons why, and we'll get into all of that over the course of this episode, where we are talking about the album Romantic Times by Louis Baloue. That's Baloue. We're not 100% on the pronunciation, but that's what we're going to do.
The only thing I really know is that this was released in 1985. Originally.
Yeah, the expensive copies. The very few that were pressed initially came out in 1985. This is Lewis's second album. He put out an album called L'Amour in 1983 that was also reissued. The reissues both came out in 2014, by the way.
Yeah, and I feel vaguely aware of this artist from was it Light in the Attic that put the reissues out?
Correct.
Yeah, I recall that happening, but I don't remember. In a weird turn of events, I don't really remember any details.
Yeah, this all came out right around the time that you and I were moving the record store and rebranding it and everything. So it was a busy time in the vinyl world of Kalamazoo in 2014.
Mm-hmm. That tracks with the vague connection I have in my brains.
Yeah. In fact, I believe the store was just getting into purchasing new vinyl around the time that Romantic Times was out and getting hyped. So there you go.
Well, what do you want to play first?
We are going to start with side A, track 1, We Danced All Night.
Danced all night and forgot the morning light and held each other tight. Your lips from the tears of perfume, never letting me go. We danced all night. I was around, won't let it go. Until you call
Upon my first listening of this album, and after Sean's instruction to not look into this album, which I gotta say was super difficult because it's deeply intriguing. Like, what is this and why? But then I've got this wave of suspicion of like, is Sean trying to trick me into saying I like the music of a serial killer? Or like, what is,
Yeah, and rest assured that's not the case, because if this were the music of a serial killer, I would be well aware of it and celebrate the entire catalog.
Of course.
Yeah, there would be a shrine to Lewis in Peter's closet somewhere.
Next to his Manson shrine.
Exactly.
Yeah, my reasoning for asking you guys to not do any research, but just familiarize yourself with the music, is that the mystery behind Lewis was a big part of the selling and like the popularity of his reissues at first. And then also was very tied in with his kind of quick disappearance from public interest again. So we'll get into all that. But I'm curious, having listened to the music, I don't know how often either of you listen to it or how much you were able to dive in, but what do you know about Lewis, if anything? And based on the music, do you have any guesses of who he is, who he was, anything? Peter, we'll start with you.
Okay. A few weeks ago, when you first suggested this and I checked out this album. So of course I started with the track that we just listened to, and it was definitely not my mood at the time. I was very perplexed by what I was listening to. But for some reason, when I went back the second time a week or two later, it started to register more. I started to see the appeal of it. Clearly it's outsider music. At the top of the program for my intro, I was quoting another outsider synthesizer musician, Gary Wilson. Even though they're very different in their nature, for some reason I got very similar vibes from this album to Gary Wilson. And I mentioned that to you in our group chat in advance, and you thought it was an apt comparison, Sean.
Yeah, I think there's a similar through line through a lot of outsider and private press music, where even if the actual end result is stylistically very different, there's a similar energy going on, oftentimes just kind of a maybe slightly undefinable strangeness to private music and real people music, as it's sometimes referred to as.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think genuine outsider music doesn't have any real sheen, or what's the word I'm looking for? Artifice to it. You're just getting the person. I think that's the difference between someone trying to be weird for the sake of being weird and someone who just is a weirdo. I mean, we could even think of Harry Nilsson as being mainstream outsider music.
Yeah, there's definitely some genuine weirdos that have found themselves at the top of the pop music world for one strange reason or another. And, there's countless others who never made it. And sometimes there was no intention of fame, just people making art because they feel the need to. Sometimes there was a desperate attempt to become famous, but no idea of how to make it happen, or, not the right set of circumstances, or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. I did, in my second listen to this the other day, when it really started to click, I did start to wonder, I started to get a vibe of somebody who may have either already been at the time this was recorded, or maybe after the time this was recorded, became very immersed in religion. I really started to wonder if, for some reason, even though I don't know that there's any direct references to religion on the album, there could be, but I'm not. I can't think of any offhand. I started to get that vibe.
Yeah, there's a real sense of earnestness to this music that you typically would find in more religious music. So it's an interesting guess there, and we'll see if you're right when we get into the bio.
Yeah, my only other thing I'll add is that I really have to think that at one point, this was released in the mid-1980s, but I'm thinking that we've already established that Light in the Attic reissued these about 10 years ago. I'm thinking that some people, some influencers of weirdo outsider music, discovered this and went on a journey to find out who this guy was. I'm guessing it wasn't readily available.
Okay, all right. Excellent guesses from Peter.
So, Jeremy, how about you?
Well, I definitely knew nothing about this. I'm gathering from some things Sean has said, maybe it's a moniker of somebody who's known for something else. But
so you thinking Lewis might be famous for something else and just kind of moonlighting as a weirdo musician?
That's what I'm gathering from what you're saying. That was not what I thought previously. Though now I'm kind of meshing it with some thoughts I had while listening to it, which was the touch point for me was kind of the band's Suicide. I felt like it was kind of in like a similar vein, and I could imagine if like one of the dudes from that band was like, let's try and cash in on the new romantic thing. And they like tried to do it, and this is what came out of it or something.
Okay, I like that.
That's my guess.
Yeah, I mean, they had Dream Baby Dream.
Yeah, they were already halfway there.
There's like a dissonance and an echoiness to the voice that, I don't know. felt similar in some ways to me.
Sure. Next question. Did either of you get a chance to listen to Lewis's first album, L'Amour, from 1983?
I don't know that I listened to the entire thing, but I checked out some of it.
Yeah, it's kind of a different vibe from this one. It's even more mellow. It's a lot more folky. It's also, I would say, less weird. It's a lot easier to get into than this album.
Yeah, the first one, I listened to it as well, and it gave me more of like a folky DIY amateur kind of feeling than like this album feels like it's a pretty fully developed weirdo's passion project or something.
Yeah, I think even though it might sound off or amateur to some ears, it seems very intentional what he's doing here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say most people prefer the first album, like a lot more. In fact, a lot of people strongly dislike the album that we are talking about today, Romantic Times. If you look on Spotify, every single track on the first album, L'Amour, has more plays than any track on Romantic Times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noticed that when I went to listen to him. I thought, oh, surely it's this album. Sean wants us to listen to this album that all the plays are from. And then I double checked. I'm like, oh no, it's the second one. It doesn't seem to be as much of a fan favorite.
Yeah. So reissues of both of these albums are no longer in print, and all the reissues of the first album are now like $100 and up, basically, in the used market.
That's why we have to go with this one.
Yes, and also this second album was the first one that I got familiar with Lewis. I had kind of a strange intro to him. As I said, the store we were working at was moving around this time, so I was probably pretty busy when this first album came out, and also we weren't ordering a lot of new vinyl at the time. So by the time the second one came out, I was a little more tuned in. And this album has just always kind of fascinated me. I definitely didn't love the music at first, but there was just something about it that drew me in and made me kept returning every once in a while. His vocal approach is so strange. The synthesizers give me a lot of like David Lynch, Twin Peaks vibes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very spacey, very strange album that has just really stuck with me since first hearing it about 10 years ago.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. There are some records, I mean, I would say Skip Spence or I was introduced to that with the whole story behind it. I don't think that the music necessarily registered with me initially, but I was so fascinated by it as kind of an artifact of the strange musician from the 1960s that I just kept coming back to it and grew to love the music.
Yeah. Not quite as uncomfortable, but you could make some late period Scott Walker comparisons again.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. When he went from teen pop idol to
The Drift.
Avant-garde weirdo.
Yeah. So basically, Romantic Times is really an album for the heads. You know, people who consider themselves connoisseurs of private press and outsider music, aka the kind of insufferable people who will also likely try to argue that Lulu is a misunderstood masterpiece, and while it may not be Lou Reed's greatest album, it certainly is Metallica's. You know, those kind of people.
Like you and I, Sean?
Yeah, basically.
I'm hearing more and more Lulu defenders come forth lately. Tom Sharpling on The Best Show will defend that album.
Heck yeah.
Yeah,
And-
we're in good company.
Yeah. I will, I need to reassess it myself. But I trust you guys. I don't remember even hating it initially when everyone was making fun of it and laughing about it. I thought there was some value to it even then, but I haven't listened in 10 years.
Well, it's time for you and the rest of our listeners. But first, let's listen to another Lewis track.
Yeah, what do you got?
Up next, It's a New Day. Side A, track 4.
And it would be so empty without you. It's a new day.
It's tough to pick a favorite track on this album, but that one is definitely mine. Probably think about that track more than other ones, or it'll pop in my head a little bit. There's just something really about it that draws me in. His very damaged vocals that kind of almost like fade in and out of the mix and like break apart at certain points. And then when he does the little falsetto parts, it's just, I love it. It's so weird. It's such an interesting mood that you don't really find very often, and especially not in cheap records.
Agreed. And yeah, I can definitely see that one in a David Lynch film.
Yes. Yeah. Especially like, Twin Peaks: The Return, when they had all those extra live band footage of the Roadhouse. It seems like one of the episodes should have just ended with, and here's Lewis.
Well, I can't take it anymore, Sean. Tell me what this is about.
Let's dive in. So I'm going to kind of tell the story as it unfolded during the time of the reissues, because this album was basically lost immediately upon release. None of Lewis's initial sales really went anywhere, and no one really knew anything about this music until 2014. So let's dive in. In 2007, a mysterious 1983 album, L'Amour, by Lewis, was discovered at a Edmonton, Alberta flea market. It was kind of passed around through some private music collecting circles and wound up on a blog spot later on.
Oh, the glory days.
The early 2010s, when you could find the most wild, interesting, obscure music on music blogs and corners of the internet. It was a special time. The album has very little information on it. The first one is just credited to Lewis, not even Louis Baloue. There's a couple credits on there for like a photographer and engineer, and then there was a hype sticker on the front that said this album contains the hit single Romance for Two, inspired by Christy Brinkley. However, this album was of course not a hit, didn't really have a single, and it seemed highly unlikely that Lewis and Christy had ever met. So, like I said, the album ends up on a music blog and gets noticed by popular reissue label Light in the Attic, who reissues the album in 2014. The album is a big hit, both critically and financially. People hailed it as a lost masterpiece. Pitchfork called it the best reissue of the year. Noisy said it just might be the best album of 2014, despite being 31 years late.
But if they were reissuing it, they had to have had some kind of ability to license these tracks to reissue it and have tracked down the owner of these recordings, right?
I mean, from what I understand, if you reissue something and tried really hard to find the person who owns it and just can't find them, then you can kind of do what you want, at least until someone who has legal ownership makes themselves known. From what I understand, Light in the Attic was trying really hard to find Lewis right away and trying to get his permission for these reissues, but also the mystery of it was a big part of the selling point of these albums. Like I said, Light in the Attic was like, we've tried and we don't really know much about this guy. We can't track him down. The prevailing theory for a while was that he was some sort of con man. Light in the Attic eventually was able to track down the photographer who was mentioned in the liner notes of the first album, and they discovered that he was paid $250 for the session in a check which bounced.
Ooh.
And he was not able to track down Lewis again after that. They also discovered that his real name is Randall Wolf. They found a studio that he'd worked at and reportedly recorded several more albums of, quote, soft religious music.
Ooh.
They also found Lewis's nephew, who hadn't heard from him in a long time, didn't know where he was, but had vague memories of Randall as a stockbroker who always dressed in white, just like on the album cover of Romantic Times, owned matching white leather furniture, and always seemed to have a supermodel on his arm.
Huh.
That's kind of the vibe you get from this music.
A little bit. I thought it was really interesting that Jeremy's first theory was some kind of like serial killer, because there's something about this album that reminds me a lot of American Psycho.
Yeah. Well, and the cover of L'Amour has a picture of his face, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, when I looked at that picture, I was like, he doesn't look like an artist type or something. I don't know, something about it didn't feel.
Yeah. And the first one is like a black and white close-up of his face that almost looks like it could have been a sketch of the Unabomber or something, like.
Yeah, Stock Trader makes sense with the picture in my mind. He has like this look that feels kind of suburban and affluent or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I imagine this guy sweated over someone else's business card being better than his at some point.
I can just imagine the lines from the movie about Huey Lewis and the News being replaced with his thoughts on the first two Lewis reissues. Light in the Attic's bio for the first album reissue ends with the line, "Lewis remains a ghost, a total mystery, but the music will be heard."
Okay.
So just as the first album is coming out and getting rave reviews, a friend of Light in the Attic's realized that they actually owned a copy of Lewis's second album, just forgotten about in their collection somewhere, and made Light in the Attic aware of it. This time it's Lewis Baloue, and the album is Romantic Times from 1985. So Light in the Attic has this huge hit on their hands, and miraculously, there's a second album that they have the ability to press up. So they decide to keep the second album a secret for a little bit. They start pressing up a bunch of copies and prepare to do a surprise release of the follow-up album later in 2014 to quickly ride the runaway success of the first album, L'Amour.
I have to wonder if some people started to speculate whether or not this was some kind of ruse that Light in the Attic was putting on it. Like,
You never know. I also just think this is so interesting because this is like the sophomore slump that feels similar to many albums we've talked about before. Like, how does an artist follow massive success? But in this case, it's an artist who never really had massive success and was creating a follow-up to a popular album decades before the popularity happens. The whole thing is fascinating.
yeah. I mean, you mentioned the con man angle, and saying that there's this hit song about Christy Brinkley on the first album, hyping it that way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like, who knows if he was actually a wealthy stockbroker or if he was just good at being one step ahead of the debt collectors. Bouncing a $250 check. The photographer had said it was like especially frustrating because this guy is like, coming into the studio with supermodels, driving expensive cars, nice suits and everything, and then bounces a $250 check for album photography.
Yeah, it's starting to sound like podcasts that I've listened to, like the Wedding Scammer podcast.
It could be. So yeah, Romantic Times. Light in the Attic has a bunch of copies, and just before they make the announcement and release the second album, another copy is discovered because, of course, collectors were frantically digging for more Lewis material after the first one is such a big hit and is so intriguing and no one knows like who this guy is or anything. So a second copy is found, sold for big money on eBay, and then leaked online for everyone to hear. And unfortunately, the critical and audience response is mostly bad to mid. And then when Light in the Attic actually releases the album, the value quickly plummets to bargain bin levels on Discogs.
It's strange that there was this collective disappointment in this album after, so much hype and fervor over the first one.
It is interesting, yeah. And if you go back and listen to these, they're both good for different reasons. So if you were obsessed with the first album and wanted that vibe again, I can understand how this one would be very disappointing. But I wholeheartedly believe that this album has quite a bit of value and replayability, or at the very least, it's a fascinating musical document.
Yeah.
Yeah, I listened to both, and without knowing any of that context, this one I found a lot more fascinating and interesting. And the first one's, I don't know, it's got some weird stuff going on, but it's more mild in its strangeness.
Yeah, I think part of the success with that was also maybe people were like, oh, this is a weirdo private press outsider record that actually just sounds like it could have been a legitimately good record kind of thing, you know? Whereas Romantic Times is like, yeah, this one is definitely got some of that damaged private press energy to it. Like there's this album, there was no way this was ever going to be a hit in any world.
Yeah.
And it's here for the true heads.
Yeah. So not too long after the first failed attempt to track down Lewis, some of the people involved with the Light in the Attic reissue go back up to Canada and are just basically driving up and down the streets where they think Lewis lives, hoping they can find him. They almost failed again, were about to give up, and then accidentally just drove past him sitting outside in a cafe, still all dressed in white, holding a cane that he didn't need, just chilling.
I was hoping he'd say he was holding a copy of the album.
Yeah, just blasting Romantic Times from a boombox. No, so they approached him and sat down and had a brief conversation with him. Randall Wolf said that he was not interested at all in looking back into the past. He seemed to be mildly pleased that his Lewis albums were a hit, but refused the offer of a $20,000 royalty check, saying, quote, he had no interest in coin.
Huh.
Yeah. So after this encounter, Light in the Attic released a statement saying that they will no longer repress Lewis's music out of respect, and also he did not give them actual permission to reissue the music or continue reissuing it. And they said that they will keep his share of sales set aside in case he ever changes his mind and wants the money.
So are there other records then? And they just haven't repressed?
Yeah, so like, you know, there was a lot of hype on this album, as I said. So a lot of people were kind of coming out trying to jump on it in any way they could. And there was a recording studio in Vancouver where Randall had recorded more music after Romantic Times under the name Randy Duke. And they began releasing these recordings, and the general audience response was, holy shit, these are even worse than Romantic Times. And the legend of Lewis just kind of quickly faded. Everyone seemed universally disappointed by this, and the mystery was gone, and everyone just kind of gave up, and no one wanted to talk about Lewis anymore. Or that's at least how it felt for a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting how people, I think, don't realize in a lot of these cases that the mystery is the big selling point. And as soon as that mystery isn't there anymore, I think in a lot of cases, people just kind of lose interest.
Yeah. It's like, oh, this is just challenging, weird music that no one's going to think I'm cool for listening to, and is going to like take some effort to understand. No thanks. Yeah,
but and it doesn't sound like anyone went and made like a Searching for Sugar Man style documentary about it. He wasn't. Well, it doesn't sound like he wanted to participate in anything like that if there wasn't anyone interested in doing that.
I would definitely watch that, though. So if you're thinking about doing that, go find him and make it. Because I would watch that doc.
He's still out there. I mean, he's probably at a cafe sipping some coffee right now, just chilling.
Dressed in white, supposedly a stockbroker who's not interested in coin.
Yeah. I like to think that he finally ripped off the right person and just doesn't have to worry about money ever again.
So, yeah, he's Canadian. I wonder if copies of these albums you can find them more easily in Canada.
I mean, they're probably all just about impossible to find at this point, but yeah, the copies that were discovered were all found in Canada.
Is there any sense of how many were originally pressed?
No, I didn't see anyone speculating on that, but there couldn't have been very many.
Yeah. I mean, like you said, that's why you'll have to go for the reissue.
Yes. I mean, you might get lucky. You never know. All the articles about Lewis are approaching 10 years old at this point. So, there's probably some stores out there that have no idea what this is. And maybe a copy will come through and sit right in their dollar bin.
Well,
Fascinating.
yeah, fascinating. I'm glad that I like you that you're getting our genuine reaction to this on the episode, Sean. I think it was the right call to keep us in the dark on this one.
Cool. There was a part of me that was just worried that you guys were just gonna be like, I don't get it. Oh, he's a stockbroker? Fuck this guy. Why should I care? This music is dumb. I mean, I didn't really think you guys were gonna say that, but that was the risk I was taking.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by stockbrokers making art. That says something to my mind.
Especially very personal, very strange, very earnest art.
Yeah, it's earnest. The other word that came to mind listening to this for me was like desperate. There's like a desperation in this.
Yeah. A real sense of longing.
Yeah. That feels, as you said, earnest and not like a put on, which, yeah, if he was trying to do a put on to make pop music, he forgot to do the pop part.
Right. Or maybe he was just so coked out in the 80s that he thought this was like a pop masterpiece that everyone in the world was going to listen to.
Yeah, well, that's what I'd be curious. Like, what were his reference points for this? What were his influences?
Yeah, totally. The other thing is, so we said, this comes out, the reissue comes out right at the right time to be on a music blog. But also, mid 2010s like that, there was still a whole lot of people obsessed with the freak folk movement. So like this album just got reissued at exactly the right time for everyone to feel like, oh, this doesn't belong in 1985 or 1983. This belongs right now. This is like relatable and almost current. So yeah, like what were his influences? It doesn't seem like it fits in with the music of the day.
Yeah, 1985.
I mean, it's the year that rock peaked. We know that.
Yeah, that's true. As we learned on our Heavy Pettin' Rock Ain't Dead episode. I mean, this is coming out the same year as Kate Bush, Hounds of Love. And I could see this being maybe the amateur response to something like that.
Yeah, maybe. The amateur response to orchestral maneuvers in the dark, maybe.
Yeah. And maybe amateur isn't I don't know if that's the right word to use, but you get what I'm saying. Like
sure.
The outsider or amateur response to that kind of music.
Or maybe like Bruce Springsteen, he just also loved the band Suicide.
Could be. All right, well, let's listen to another song, and then we'll wrap it up after this. But I'm going to play the song Bringing You a Rose, Side B, Track 2.
It's all night. just waiting for us to meet. Bringing you arrows, and with every step that I take.
Yeah, listening to this now with a lot more context for who's creating it, I think I'm more confused than I was the first time I listened.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. The mystery isn't actually gone. I mean, it's not a complete mystery like it was at one point, but there's still a lot of questions. And yeah,
Yeah, it definitely gives me more questions having the info that you've provided than having no knowledge.
after the first album was reissued, Christy Brinkley posted something about it and said, "This album is transporting, but while I recall some things, my memory is as blurry as the hazy songs." And her publicist later stated that Brinkley cannot recall whether she dated or even met Randy, but believes it's possible.
Huh.
I wonder if she remembers me.
Yeah.
But,
You had a chance encounter.
well, one of her ex-husbands is Peter Cook.
Oh.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I mentioned on our, I think it was the Sarah Vaughan episode that I went over the other Peter Cooks out there.
Right.
Yeah.
You should add that to your new Cosmic Boy album.
Oh, let's plug it now. Speaking of weirdo outsider music, I have released for the first time in a long time on my own, or kind of me as the leading creative force. I did put something out into the world, The Cosmic Boy, available on Bandcamp.
And would you say you named that after an incredible string band album that I brought to the podcast?
A song on, yeah, you were the influence, but after you brought that album and song Cosmic Boy to the podcast, which, to be fair, that was an album I wasn't really familiar with by them prior, so you're part of the inspiration, Jeremy.
Aw.
But yes, that's available out there for those who want to check it out. It's bordering on harsh noise with some differences, just as a forewarning.
Yeah, it was much harsher than I expected.
Yeah, unlike anything I've really released before. I used the equipment rig that I've put together for the Kalamazoo Drone Society that I do with former guests, both Brad Miller and Ike Turner. We are all participate in that project together. So yeah, a lot of fun though. It's nice to have something on my own musically out there again.
Yeah, it's a great album. I really enjoyed listening to it. It is, as Jeremy said, harsher than I expected, but it's still very textural and has some really interesting, fun repetition on it. I was able to really zone out while listening to it. Fun project.
Yeah, I tried for there to be a journey. It's not just like a wall of noise.
Yeah. It's certainly not just messing around with sounds and making something off-putting for 20 minutes, as oftentimes harsh noise does feel like.
Oh, well, thank you, Sean. Best review yet. Only review yet, but
No problem.
Now, did you make that album so we'd have any recommended similar albums to throw out, or?
I was going to say that's perfect because I literally only wrote down 2. So we'll make Cosmic Boy the unofficial third recommended if you like. You can't find it in the dollar bin though.
yeah, I mean, it's not a dollar bin album, but the Gary Wilson "You Think You Really Know Me" album is what I would recommend for people interested in hearing something like this, but a little more playful and goofy.
Sure. Yeah, there was lots of comparisons that could be made to records that are expensive, but finding stuff like this, you either have to go completely obscure. Could recommend some more private press religious music, but yeah, tough to find something readily available that matches this energy.
What'd you find, though?
So I thought of 2. One is actually the story of the reissue is very, very similar. It's an older album that this time was never actually reissued, or never, this time it was never issued initially. And then the reissue was brought out to kind of ride the success of another reissue and just didn't hit at all. I'm talking about the album Ocean of Love, reissued in 2017 by Patarenga John Henderson. This was an album put out by David Byrne's Luwaka Bop label, and it was following the very successful Alice Coltrane reissue from around that time. They had put out some late period music from Alice Coltrane, where when she was living in a religious commune and making some very synthesizer heavy religious music, and the reissue took off, sold really well, people loved it. And the John Henderson album was music very similar. He was a guy living in the commune with Alice Coltrane. They worked together. The album is a similar vibe and a perfect sequel. Released it for Record Store Day. No one cared. Instantly became a bargain bin record that no one even knew existed.
I'm going to guess that's because his name was not Alice Coltrane.
That was a big part of it, yes. That, and when you release something on a day when there's 400 other new releases, it's inevitable that some of them are going to get lost in the shuffle.
And we plug them here.
We plug them here. Second recommendation is a newer artist, a good friend of mine, someone who has not been on the show, but maybe someday. And I think that his music definitely has a little bit of similarity to Lewis. And as is the case with many newer DIY artists, his music is not very valuable on Discogs, even though I think it's brilliant. I'm talking about the 2014 album Blanton Ravine by my friend Public Speaking.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Public Speaking had some releases through Already Dead tapes, correct?
Correct.
And I believe at one of the Already Dead family reunions, Public Speaking was performing, and I was sitting there starting to think, I'm really getting some Scott Walker vibes from this. And then a friend of the show, Nate Hartman, either texted me or came up to me and was like, "You feeling Scott Walker?"
There you go. Yeah, I love Public Speaking's music. Some of my favorite concerts, one of my favorite artists to play with, and the vinyl releases are, I think, minor masterpieces that you can still buy for less than $10 on Discogs. So support modern DIY music whenever you can.
Yeah, and along those same lines, another artist who released stuff through Already Dead, now that you mention that, I'm kind of thinking Move-Ons.
Sure.
Move-Ons, it was a little more hip-hop influenced, but there was something similar, more expertly executed than this, I would say.
Yeah, I suppose we should also mention yet again another Already Dead artist, and this time actually a former guest and friend of the show, David Drucker, aka Painted Faces. He's got, I believe, 2 vinyl releases on ESP disc now, and the first one is kind of cheap on Discogs. Tales from the Skinny Apartment. Some very interesting weirdo outsider music.
Just saw him perform recently. Had some legendary hangs here in Kalamazoo.
As did I in Philly. Same tour.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't realize this was going to be the Already Dead plug corner, but I guess that, this could have probably come out on Already Dead.
I think that meshes with what Sean was saying earlier, that this took off in the 2010s because it felt like music of that time.
Yeah.
Which is when a lot of this stuff was coming out.
Yeah. Fascinating. This, really ahead of its time.
Yeah. Or completely outside of time.
Take your pick.
Or romantic times.
Perfect. Well, I think that should probably say it all, unless we had any final thoughts.
One quick bit of trivia. He got the name Lewis because that was a reference to his great-grandmother's last name. And if you want to do just a little bit of further research, in 2015, Maxim did a cool story on Lewis. They contacted the studio that I had mentioned, had been releasing the Randy Duke material that everyone hated. And they actually discovered that the studio, unable to contact Randy, had decided that the music he had recorded wasn't good, and they obviously should get their own band to record new backing tracks underneath his vocals, which is partly why everyone hated it. Maxim claims that the studio has about 10 albums worth of unreleased material from Randy, and said that the original files without the new studio band are great and just as raw as the early material. They also tracked Lewis down for an interview. He says that he still works on music every single night and may release more albums, but he's not sure.
He has a Prince-style vault.
Yeah, man, the Lewis vault has got to be just nuts at this point. Because there was someone else that was associated with him that was found who said that he had always considered the stockbroking to be just a means to make music, and that despite the trappings of wealth and success and everything, he always seemed most devoted to just making his own strange music as often as possible.
So, yeah, it seems it is. Maybe in the long run, we can conclude that this is genuine.
I think so. There's a handful of like cool little anecdotes and stories that Lewis has shared in the couple encounters with people. Who knows if any of them are true? He claims to have at one point hung out with George Harrison and given him fashion advice on how to properly wear cowboy boots.
I knew that George didn't have that in him naturally. I knew someone must have schooled him.
Yeah.
Some Canadian stockbroker must have taught him how to wear cowboy boots, right?
Yeah. Oh, also apparently Lewis is like 6'4".
Wow.
That's tall.
Just a huge chill dude, always dressed in white.
Yeah, I guess that is maybe someone you could just happen to drive by in a city and be like, oh, there he is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Makes me want to go. Just track down Lewis, share a coffee with him.
Well,
We could get him to guest, have him pick an album.
Yeah. What's your favorite bargain bin album, Lewis?
I'm realizing this might be the closest that we get to doing a Jandek episode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. Jandek and Lewis World Tour 2025.
Make it happen.
Yeah. The concert that maybe actually no one wants to see.
Oh. Well, what are you going to leave us with, Sean?
We're going to go out on the last track on the album, side B, track 4, As the Boats Go By.
I remember when you originally sent the tracks for our listeners, a little peek behind the curtain. Usually the day or the day before we record these episodes, we just let the other co-hosts know which tracks we're going to be talking about from the album. And the sequence of track titles that you gave us sounded like poetry.
Right, because I normally send them all in one message, but I sent like 2 and then accidentally sent it and then sent the following 2. So it really kind of reads like poetry, like you said.
We danced all night. It's a new day. Bringing you a rose as the boats go by.
Beautiful.
Wow. That reminded me of romantic times in my life. Not the album.
Well. On that note, we will say our goodbyes here on I'd Buy That for $1. Thank you so much for listening. Of course, you can always check us out on Patreon over at patreon.com/I'd Buy That podcast for more content. We have bonus episodes. We have special curated mixes. We have the vinyl tier where we will send you an album and a 45 plus a handwritten note. So go check that out over at patreon.com/I'd Buy That podcast. As the goats go by, that would be
boat by.
yeah, as the goats boat by, that would be a, like Jandek and Lewis mashup right there. I am co-host Peter Cook.
I'm co-host Jeremy Ruggles.
And I'm co-host Sean Hartman.
As the boats go by. Goodbye.
Oh, then nothing's you. Nothing else will do. As the bones go by, all along the canals, we kiss and we held. As the bones went by, it's good to be alive. The spirit burning inside. Oh, as the bones go by. Making love, a gift from above, as the bones go by.